Hello and welcome to the Ignoramus Polymath. Today is episode 7 and we're going to be talking about market equilibriums. Before I even get started, I just want you guys to know that this is probably gonna be a very long one, but because of some feedback that I got from some of the viewers, some of my friends, and some suggestions that I got from people across the internet and just going through stuff, I came across Blender and I think I'm gonna be editing videos and stuff now, like just basic adding in pictures and stuff instead of just one logo there. I think that's gonna make it a little more interactive, and also I figured out this really powerful tool called Desmos, and I'm going to be using that to make the graphs and stuff, and I feel like that's going to be a really better way to be understanding the concepts, because then you can see the things in front of you, even though this is more like a podcast. But still, I think it helps with the visuals, since the content that I'm trying to cover is pretty visual in its essence, right? So market equilibriums, I just want to start off by telling you guys about how exactly the market is kind of organized, because I mean, it seems kind of difficult, or it seems kind of confusing at first, because supply increases and then prices increase and blah blah blah, so many other difficult concepts to understand. But understand in a very simple way. Let me tell you a story of sorts, right? Imagine the Mona Lisa, the painting Mona Lisa, right? So there's only one Mona Lisa painting on earth, there's only one, no more. So say for example, let's just say it's not in a museum, let's just say it's up for sale, right? So if the Mona Lisa was up for sale, you'd see that there are people who want it, and then they definitely have an auction, right? So they would have an auction, and then someone would probably start off okay, I'll pay a few million, I'll pay 50 million, and then someone else comes in who wants the Mona Lisa more, and then they'll say, okay, I'll pay 70 million, and then someone else says, okay, you know what, I don't really care about what others say, I'm just going to pay $2 billion for this, and that's it, end of story. But then someone else comes over, and maybe they say that, okay, you know what, I don't care what the other guy said, I'm gonna pay $5 billion for this. And I don't know, somehow eventually maybe the Mona Lisa gets sold at $20 billion or so, let's say. So in that case, what happened here? There was only one of it, there was only one painting, and people bid up the prices until it went up to $20 billion. Now imagine, instead of there being I don't know, one painting, let's just consider something to be a little something a little more common, right? Imagine a typical calculator, right, that I have in front of me. So for example, this calculator, there's only 5,000 of them, right? Let's say there's only 5,000 of these calculators, but the problem here is that, well, there's 10,000 people who want it. But what does this mean? This means that there's not enough supply. There's not enough supply to fulfill the demand, right? Because you have supply of 5,000 because you're only producing 5,000 calculators, but there are 10,000 people who want it. So what happens then is that people start bidding up the prices. That's kind of how markets are organized, right? You'll see that people are willing to pay more. They're like, okay, you know what? Even if the market price is probably 3,000 taka or something, I'm willing to pay 5,000 because there's a shortage of it, and I'll pay 5,000. And then someone else says I'll pay more, I'll pay 6 or 7,000, and then that's how the price gets like the price is bid up, and then it goes higher. And then once the prices reach a higher point, sellers or suppliers understand that, okay, you know what, this is a pretty expensive thing, right? People are buying it a lot. And what happens when price increases? Supply increases. So in that case, if demand is less, usually if supply is less, or if there is less supply or of something, usually demand drives up the supply, like the way I explained here. Or like talk about situations where maybe you have less demand of something and you have a lot of supply. So in those cases, maybe like you have 10,000 calculators, but only 5,000 people want to buy it. So supply is 10,000 and demand is only 5,000. In those cases, the prices become really low. They'd have to sell the product at a very low price to make sure that people actually buy it. And then in those cases, what usually happens is the price is brought down because of the way that market and supply is like market demand and supply is organized, and then that's how the price comes back to something called equilibrium price. But more onto that, like basically what I'm trying to say is that you've always heard about how the is like um, market is controlled by the forces of supply and demand. So this is exactly how the market is organized, by the quote unquote forces of demand and supply. So now I think I'm gonna have a diagram upon, yeah, I guess that's it. So this is like a I think you understand that there is a supply curve here, which is the red one, and there is a demand curve here, which is the blue one. So understand this, equilibrium prices. So what exactly is the equilibrium price? It sounds a little confusing, but it kind of sounds on point as well. The equal price. Well, what does that mean, right? It's exactly what it kind of should be, right? It's where price is similar. So where demand and supply are equal. So in this case, I think its price is 80 and quantity is something like, I guess that's 125. Yeah, I guess that's 125. That should be 125. So in this case, the price is 80. So the equilibrium price is 80 as well. So 80 taka. This means that at 80, suppliers are willing to produce 125 of whatever this quantity may be, and at 80 taka, demand, as well as like meaning that consumers are also willing to buy somewhat like 125 of those items. So it kind of matches up. So this, and to understand this better, it's easier to use another word, right? It's called the market clearing price. So now it started to make sense, isn't it? Because it's clearing the market. Because remember when I said that I had only 5,000 calculators and 10,000 people who wanted to buy it? In those cases, there was a shortage of 5,000, meaning that the market wasn't cleared, or not everyone was happy in the market. Or in those cases where there was 10,000 calculators being sold and 5,000 being bought. So in those cases as well, the market wasn't cleared because the market isn't cleared. There's still 5,000 calculators just lying around. So in both of these cases, the market isn't clearing. But if you look at this situation, the equilibrium quantity here is 125. So if you look at 125, you'll realize that at this point, 125 people are buying and 125 people are supplying, meaning that there is no extra being wasted or there is no more being wanted by the people. So this is kind of like, okay, so I produced 5,000 calculators and 5,000 people bought those calculators. So there is no one who's unhappy in the market. The suppliers are happy because all of their products are sold, and the consumers are happy because all of them got to buy their, I don't know, they were very happy because they got to buy their calculators, right? So that's exactly how the equilibrium price is organized. And then you have to understand, now we're going to be talking about total revenues. So total revenue is basically saying how much you earn from the sale, right? So amount of money generated from the sale of goods calculated by multiplying price by quantity. So it's very much simple, because once you get down to like the equilibrium price and quantity, so equilibrium price here is 80 and quantity is 125. In this case, it's very easy to realize that, okay, so considering that it's in equilibrium, if it is in equilibrium, so however much you produce, that much is being sold as well. So that's also the amount of like items that are being bought. So there is no extra, or there is no wastage of like things. So in those cases, you can calculate your total revenue just by calculating how much is the equilibrium price and how much is the equilibrium quantity. How does this work? You're selling one calculator at 3,000. So that's like, okay, so that's 3,000. Your total revenue is 3,000. If you sell two of them at 3,000, then it's 6,000. If you sell five calculators at 3,000, that's 5 threes, 15,000. And in this case, you can see that the equilibrium price is 80 and the equilibrium quantity is 125, which if you multiply, let me get my calculator out, that's 10,000. So here we can say that the total revenue is 10,000 because we multiplied how much was sold and at what price it was sold. So that's how much you gained, right? By selling all of those, whatever you sold, right? Let's say calculators. I mean, that's pretty cheap if you're selling calculators at 80 taka, but yeah, you get the point. And then let's move on to another topic. And I think this is where we come on to another diagram. And yeah, this is basically going to show you how exactly shift in demand works. So as you can see, there is one supply curve and there are three demand curves. So what happens in this situation is that sometimes in the market, demand increases and demand decreases, right? I mean, it can happen all the time because we talked about what, like, the factors that change demand in, I think that was some previous episode. So in those cases, there is no denying that demand will change, but what happens when demand changes, right? So let's look at that. If you look at the middle one, that's, let's just say that's where it was, like that's where it is in normal cases. But then let's say for some reason the demand increases and then it shifts to the right. So you have the rightwards demand curve. By the way, if you're still confused, the demand curve is the blue one and the supply curve is the red one. So let's say the demand curve shifts to the right. So you have the rightwards demand curve there. So what happens in this case? Do you realize that um, here, so the way you can calculate the equilibrium price and quantity is by seeing where the demand and supply curves intersect. So in this case, if you see where the demand and supply curves intersect, you'll see that it's probably somewhere around 80. That's like, I think 90. The price goes up to 90 and the equilibrium quantity, which is however much is being sold in the market, that goes up to, I think that's 140, that's 150. So it goes somewhere around like 90 price and 150 quantity. So do you realize what happened here? In this case, the price increased because demand increased and also the quantity increased. So like all of this boils down to like a few basic principles, right? So the idea here is that when demand increases, price and quantity both increase because at every given price, consumers are willing to buy more. So that's why quantity increases as well. But more so because since the demand curve increases, it intersects with the supply curve at a higher price. So all of those combined together mean that price increases and so does quantity, right? As you can see by the intersection of the rightwards demand curve. Now let's look at the leftwards demand curve. Maybe there was some trouble, maybe they're going through some sort of income problem in the country and income decreases for everyone in the country. In those cases, demand shifts to the left. And what happens when demand shifts to the left? Do you see that it's the leftward demand curve? And what do we see here? We see here that the price went down to, I think that's 60, almost 60, somewhere like 65 or something maybe. And price went down to 65 and the quantity also went down to something like 105 or something. So what's happening here? What you realize is that the previous equilibrium quantity here was, I think that's 80 and 125, and it went down. The price went down to 65 and the equilibrium quantity went down to 105. So in both cases, there is a reduction in price and quantity. So that kind of explains both of the ideas as well, I think. So what happens when demand increases and what happens when demand decreases. So let's talk about the other one. I think it's going to change now. Yeah, the new curve. Yeah, that's another diagram. So this shows us the shift in supply. So what happens when there is a shift in supply? We've already talked about how exactly there can be a shift. So let's talk about, like, maybe there was an increase in subsidy in maybe some particular field of whose, like, demand supply curve we're looking at right now. So maybe there was an increase in subsidy in that particular sector and supply increases, right? So what happens, what's the general rule that we see when supply increases? We see that equilibrium price falls, but the quantity rises, because if you look at the rightwards supply curve here, you will see that the price from before has decreased because the previous price was, as usual, from just like the last one, that was 80, right? But now the price has gone down to something like 65, I guess, or that could be 70 as well. Yeah, but what happens is the quantity increases. It's because you're willing to supply more at every given price. And since the supply curve shifts to the right, the intersection happens at a lower price than before. So in those cases, the general rule is that equilibrium price falls, but quantity rises, right? So on the other hand, right, let's look at what happens when supply decreases. So what happens when supply decreases, maybe there was an increase in taxes, or maybe they just government thought, let's take away the subsidy. We don't really care about what happens in this sector anymore. So subsidy goes away and maybe tax increases or something, or maybe both happen at once. In those cases, there is a leftward shift in the supply curve. So you can see the leftwards supply curve here, and if you look at that, you will realize that in this case price rises because, and okay, so why does price rise, right? Price rises because it intersects the demand curve at a higher price, and also because also you'll realize that the quantity decreases. So if supply decreases, the price increases, and also the quantity decreases as well. Why does this happen? It's because at every given price, suppliers are willing to give lesser or supply less items, but also because since the supply curve shifts to the left, and if it shifts to the left, you will see that it intersects the demand curve at a higher price. So maybe now the price has gone up to, I think that's 90.95 at prices 90.95, somewhere around that, or and quantity something like 105. So what happens here is that the general rule is that equilibrium price will rise but demand will fall. And now we have something that's going to be pretty confusing, because this can happen in the market as well, where supply and demand both change at once. So the next diagram, which you're going to see, I think, in a while, it's going to be kind of intimidating, but hang on there. So that's 3 demand curves and 3 supply curves. So, but what I want you guys to understand here is that this diagram is just to show you that sometimes supply increases and demand decreases and demand increases, but like in most cases, it's very unpredictable as to what exactly happens to the price and quantity, because as you can see in this diagram, the changes are very uniform. It's very, like, the spaces are uniform, but in most cases the space won't be uniform, because in the real world things aren't as predictable. So what happens in those cases is maybe sometimes supply will increase more and demand will decrease less, and then sometimes, so you cannot find a general rule of thumb here that, okay, you know what, when demand increases and supply increases, then price increases and demand increase, quantity increases and whatnot. So those are not like valid in this situation. But what you can do is you can try and look at this diagram, because I don't really think I can help you much in like explaining this diagram itself. But what you can see here is that to look at it visually, it really helps to understand that what exactly happens when demand increases and supply decreases. You can see that, okay, so I think there are a few general rules here, like a very few, but like not in terms of like quantity, but and not always though, but like look at this, for example. Look at the leftward supply curve and look at the rightward demand curve. So that means that supply has decreased and demand has increased. In those cases, you can see that price rose, but when you see that supply has increased and demand has decreased, you can see that price falls from the equilibrium price, which is like the top intersection, the top of, I think that's a kite. So the top of the kite, the intersection, and the intersection at the bottom of the kite. And then there is a left one and there is a right one as well. So that happens when demand increases and supply increases as well, and demand decreases, supply decreases too. So in both cases, like, it's very confusing. But if you think about different situations, I think there's only 4 different combinations that can happen. Demand increases, supply increases, that's one. Number 2, demand increases and supply decreases. Then you have demand decreases and supply increases, that's 3. And number 4 is demand decreases and supply decreases. But that's like if you have only 4 different lines here, we have 6 here because we also have like a constant one, which is the normal one. So in this case it's more confusing, but it helps to understand, and you will eventually, I just want you guys to pause here if you can and just like wonder about what are the possibilities and how exactly it may result in. And then now I'm going to talk about excess demand. So excess demand is kind of easy to understand. I think this is the diagram here. It should be here right now. So look at excess diagram. In excess diagram, so what you can see here is that there is like 2 orange points at the top, and that's 2 green points at the bottom, I think. So here we just need to think about some stuff, right? So what's the equilibrium price here? Equilibrium price here is that was 80 before. So let's imagine that someone, or because of some reason, the market price suddenly becomes 100. Okay, so if you look at the price at 100, you'll see that there are 2 different points on the demands and supply curves, which are the orange points. I think those are either orange or yellow. They could be either. So look at the orange or yellow points there, and you'll see that both of them are above the demand. Both of them are above the equilibrium point. But what you see here is that in one place, quantity is more than equilibrium quantity, and in another, which is the demand curve, quantity is less than equilibrium quantity. So what does this mean? It means that if you look at the diagram here, you'll realize that when the price is 100, the supply curve is the red one. So you see that the supply is increasing. So before the supply was, or the quantity, equilibrium quantity was 125, but now the supply quantity is, I think that's 165, I guess. Yeah, that's like 165. But at the same price, the demand decreases because less people are willing to buy at that price. So what you see here is that demand falls down to, that's, I think, a little less than 100. That's 95 maybe, I don't know. So that's, yeah, maybe 95. So what happened here? What we saw here is that this is what we call excess supply. Yeah, this is what we call excess supply, because, and this is also called surplus, like there is a market surplus because there is more being supplied than being like demanded. So if we look here, I think that's 165, and we subtract 95 there, so that's 70. So there is a market surplus of 70. Because how did we figure this out? Because look at this, the supply is 165. If you look at the diagram there, I think that's 165, and the demand of, like, the demand quantity is only 95. So that means that there are 165 items in the market, but only 95 are being bought. So if you subtract 95 from 165, 70 are remaining, meaning that 70 products or 70 items are still remaining in the market because nobody wants to buy them, or nobody bought them, because the number of people buying them has decreased. But look at the other one, right? Look at excess supply. Let's talk about excess demand. Let's look like below. So here you realize that I think that's 20, 40, 60. So price here is 60. If price is 60, the opposite happens. At equilibrium price, at equilibrium price, the quantity demanded, or like, however much people bought was 125. But once the price goes down, so before the price was 80, now it's 60. So that's like a 20 reduction. But when the price does reduce, you'll see that, okay, so the price is reduced, so suppliers are less willing to produce it, because if you know your law of supply, you'll know that as price decreases, supply decreases. But you also know, because of your law of demand, that as price decreases, demand increases. So what happens here? In this case, you'll realize that if you look at the red line, which is the supply curve, only 95 are being produced, right? And you'll realize that, but 165 people actually want to buy it, meaning that there is a 70 item shortage in the market, because that's what we call this is excess demand in this case, because there is more demand than there is actual supply. So in this case, this is called a market shortage. So both of these can happen in the markets. I think both of these diagrams helped you understand the kinds of like situations that can happen in the markets. And there are some ways that you can remove the excess supply and demand, because obviously you need to make sure that the market goes back to equilibrium. If you've heard what I said at the beginning, you'll realize that that happens kind of naturally to begin with. But then there are some tactics that you can use to actually like remove the excess supply and demand. So in cases of excess demand, when your supply is less but more people want it, so maybe you're producing, as the first example I gave, maybe you're producing 5,000 calculators, but 10,000 people want it. In those cases, what you can do is you can increase the price of your calculators. What happens then is that as price increases, if you know your laws, as price increases, demand decreases and supply increases. So then eventually we go back to the equilibrium point. But then also what you can do is 10,000 people want it, so let's just give it to them. We just like increase the supply. And in those cases as well, if you do increase supply, you can eventually um, drive it down back to the equilibrium point, because you're supplying more, you're fulfilling the demand, and then it eventually just, and then lesser people want it, and then it just goes back to the equilibrium point. But look at the other side of it, right? What happens when you have excess supply? You're producing too much, but nobody wants to buy them, right? So what do you do here? Here, what you can do is you can lower your prices, because you're producing too much but at a very high price. And what happens here is that not many people want to buy it at that price. What you can do is reduce the price so more people are willing to buy it. In this case, you can see that in excess supply, there is like more more supply than there is demand. So in those cases, if you lower your prices, it will eventually come back to the equilibrium point. But more so, another thing that you can do, but this is like very exceptional, because this is only applicable in cases where the item that you're selling is not like doesn't get like doesn't expire in like a very quick time. Maybe it's food, so in those cases you cannot do this. But what you can do is store it for selling it later. Maybe at one point you realize that someday the price will change and more people will be willing to buy it, and something will happen, so I can sell it then and not sell it now. So in those cases you can store it. You can just like keep it in your storage and then just wait for things to settle down, and then you can sell them. So that can also happen, but it's not always applicable, because especially if you're like, I don't know, if you're selling wheat, then, or if you're selling like, I don't know, bread, in those cases I don't think you can really store them for later, because nobody will buy them if it's like 2 weeks old or maybe a month old, because nobody was willing to buy it back then. So you thought, okay, you know what, let's just store it and sell it. Nobody will want that. So it doesn't apply in all cases, but it applies in some. I think this was pretty fun, because I actually had a lot of fun building the graphs and stuff in Desmos. You should like try them as well. Like I am definitely not being sponsored by Desmos, but maybe I wish I was. But yeah, you can use it. It's a very powerful tool. I'll probably link it down below as well. And you can check it out. And that's it. Thanks for listening, and I wish you all the best in your journey of gathering knowledge. Thank you.